Welcome to Class 4 with the Digital Academy and the House of Dukes, as we take a deep dive behind the scenes into how I light my interiors, what influences my choices around the kinds of lights I use, and how I frame my shots with lighting in mind. We'll be looking at The Room, the first in our series of interior staging tutorials using Blender, as we furnish our spaces with items that can be found or explored through the House of Dukes. My name is Kyle Stephen, and welcome officially to the lighting session with Blender. Lighting inside of Blender is fairly straightforward in both of its render modes. Using cycles or Eevee will give you differing results in terms of realism versus stylization. But the overall process of building and lighting a scene inside of Blender is actually very simple by design. The real trick is knowing what kinds of lights to use, where to use them, how many you'd need, and what kind of materials and geometry you're lighting. In this class, we'll be looking at how to use the Blender Kit add-on to build out your scenes and looking at how to add lights in creative and efficient ways. To follow along, make sure to install Blender by downloading it from blender.org and then downloading the Blender Kit add-on from blenderkit.com. Once Blender is installed and the add-on is installed into Blender, we can begin. Blender by itself is an amazing tool for modeling, sculpting, texturing, lighting, and animation. The process of modeling objects in Blender can vary depending on the purpose of the models as well as the level of customization of the components of those models. But if you're not as confident in your modeling skills and you have a foolproof idea or concept for a scene, environment, or animation, Blender Kit is the asset library that makes the scene building process more streamlined. With the add-on installed, you can browse a long selection of community-built and uploaded models, materials, and HDRIs that cover a wide variety of different themes, genres, and quality levels. For The Room, the assets used from the Blender Kit library were handpicked based on the style of the models. In some instances, the models were retextured using the free materials found in the Materials tab inside of Blender Kit. In most cases, you have the ability to swap your materials automatically onto models that have been UV unwrapped already. But if you have to unwrap your models, first select it, hit Tab on the keyboard, and then hit U. The Unwrap menu should pop up, and you can select the type of unwrapping that you need for your geometry. Test them out if you're not sure. The concept behind this room was to give it an antique, classical finish with a hint of rustic elements. The entire room is covered in wood panels from ceiling to floor and is complemented by high-quality teak furniture and cabinets that house reading material for the refined gentleman. The overall aesthetic leans heavily into the tone and feel of a gentleman's club, but with a touch more exclusivity in smaller numbers. The environment itself is devoid of modern technology, paying homage to an era where community among men prided itself in intelligent and productive conversation. And to top it off, the lighting of the space creates a calm and relaxing ambience that reflects the quaint setup of the room and the time-locked elements inside of it. To begin with, once the overall layout of the objects in this room is complete, the next critical step is to determine where might be the best places to position your lights. Lighting setups should always be practical in planning and then artistic in execution. Placements of your lights depends on the type of lights, the strength, and temperature. Direct and spotlights have a different effect on spaces to point and area lights. These are drastically different to sunlights and HDRI lights. HDRI lighting is used to create the environmental lighting or the global illumination. This is what creates the effect of natural outside light coming through the window and into the room. With the HDRI selected from the Blender Kit tab and the position of the HDRI locked in, the next step is to install the lights on the interior that create the effect, tone, and mood that we want. Finding reference images for this part of the process would be a good idea. Having as many different iterations of the kind of room you want to create, along with the lighting setups that illuminate those spaces, puts you levels ahead of artists that work with no plan. Study the lights in the reference images and use the information to map the areas of influence for the lights. This just means to look at the types of lights in the scenes to figure out where you may need direct lighting, soft lighting, harsh lights, rim lights, aesthetic lights, and area or fill lights. When lights are being installed in the real world, their positions are usually relative to the functionality of the spaces that they are lighting. Once adequate coverage of the spaces can be achieved through strategic lights, creating contrast in specific areas and casting backlights to the silhouettes of objects, you can then consider the creative side to your lighting setup. Creative lighting is not always technically sound. However, a technically sound and strategically lit scene can be enhanced by utilizing certain creative lighting techniques. These techniques can look like using highly saturated colored lights, using multiple light sources to simulate glows, and even bending the shape of the lights in the scene to align with more creative results. In this scene, I'll focus on how I built the coffee table setup. The idea behind this table area was that I wanted to make the staging feel calculated, but also organic in this presentation. The items I chose were also intentional, with each piece having its own mini story behind it. Using the Blender Kit search bar, I searched for each item by category and placed them onto the table. For example, to find the book, I searched book and browsed the options that came up. Now, there is a pro user side to the Blender Kit add-on, but this is actually good because given that the entire material library and I believe their HDRI library is completely free, it's understandable that there are some models that are locked until you become a pro supporter of the Blender Kit team. Choose out of the free options that are available by filtering the options down to free, and you should be good to go. With the objects in the scene and the standard materials looking good, I needed to add the additional lights. The outside HDRI light is in fact providing light to the area, but it isn't powerful enough to illuminate the shot in the way that I want with the kind of lighting effects that I want. In Blender, there are 4 standard types of lights that are made available to you: the point light, sunlight, spotlight, and area light. These 4 light types, when combined with world lighting generated by the HDRI, can and have proven to stand up to the task of creating realistic, cinematic, and creative lighting results. Adding lights can be done by pressing Shift-A and then going down to the Light tab. You can create as many lights as you need this way. When choosing your lights, consider this. Sunlights are world-scale directional lights that are usually used to simulate the direct sunlight. These generally work best when creating environments, outside scenes, or even in this case, diffuse outside light to an indoor setting. Area lights are excellent for lighting large surface areas, edge lighting, diffused directional light, and portal lights, because the area light does not have light leaking or fall off in its opposing direction. Point lights are omnidirectional small-scale or indoor lights that are used to light broad areas in all directions. Like all the other lights, the power and fall off of the point light depends on the settings used in the setting where it's being used. This just means that lights like the point light can be used to simulate the lighting of lamps, bulbs, fire, fireflies, glints, and glows. It really just depends on how you use it. Spotlights most should know just by its name, or you should at least be familiar with from seeing a version of a spotlight at some point in your life. Be it on a stage, a search helicopter, a flashlight, or even your car headlights, all are possible places you may have seen one. Spotlights are excellent for creating conical-shaped beams of light that can be attached to objects or placed into scenes to simulate beams of light from a light source or rays of light from the sky through a window. Now that we've touched on the different types of lights, I'll explain the rationale behind the light placements in this scene. The common misconception around lighting 3D scenes is that you need many different lights from multiple angles at varying intensities, followed up by a gradient of varying color temperatures in order to make your scene feel lit and seem technically sound. The reality is, when you determine things like mood and tone of a room and you look for reference, the lights in the reference images are usually all there is to it. So working with the same number of light sources as your reference images or videos gives you a great neutral place to work from. Identifying the types of lights in your reference may be a challenge at first, but when looking at how the 4 or 5 different types of lighting options inside of Blender behave, you can begin to get a sense of how the reference translates into your CG scenes. Point lights were the main lights used in this scene because I wanted the omnidirectional fall-off of the light to bounce around my scene and onto the different objects I began to furnish the space with. Because I had already planned to use wood as the core texture and color aesthetic, I knew that the warmer colors and tones would be prominent in the assets being used, so my lighting needed to follow the theme. The lights by default come with a white color, but you can adjust the color of the light or the temperature of the lights to match your scene. The aim was to simulate the kinds of yellow light or warm colored lamps you'd find in living rooms or very curated spaces. I relied on the materials to absorb and in some cases bounce the color of the lights, creating a very natural and subtle effect. Proximity of the lights to the subjects in your scenes will affect the power and fall-off distance of your lights. Or rather, the power and the fall-off distance of your lights will affect the subjects in your scenes depending on the proximity of the light to your subjects. Compensating for the distance between your lights and subjects makes all the difference. When aiming for intense directional or edge lighting, using high power levels with a smaller fall-off radius usually works together to create the desired lighting effects. Additionally, when setting up your virtual camera and using depth of field, the effects of lights in the background, backdrop, or out in the distance becomes blurred and diffused, adding an additional layer of light play. Adjusting the f-stop of your camera allows for the lens to interpret the light sources differently, depending on the size of lens used, the focal distance, and the angle of the light to the camera. Before I forget, when working with lights inside of Blender, whether cycles or Eevee, be sure to check the amount of bounces that you allow for the light to interact with the scene. The higher the value, the cleaner the results, but be cautious, as this can lead to a significant increase in how much GPU or CPU resources that might be needed when producing the final render. This principle applies to the sample count also. Having a reasonable sample count for both the viewport and final render allows for a smoother flow for the decision making around lights in production. Now that you've added your objects and added your lights, it's always good to do a couple render checks from multiple angles in your room. This way, you get to see the effect that the lights in your scene are having on the objects and materials in the space. Where light may be enough for one area, when framed in camera, it may not actually be enough for another area. However, this process can get a bit tricky as you may find yourself adding lights to certain areas or removing lights from other areas, which end up affecting your overall lighting progress thus far. It's good to have a couple pre-planned dedicated frame shots in mind so that you can light with those angles in mind. Lastly, it's much more efficient to work in Blender in the solid or flat shaded mode, as it allows you to navigate your scenes without having to process all of the elements in real time. While real-time display is indeed possible, it detracts from the resources of the system that can be used to do something else. You can add lights in this mode, but you need to switch over to the rendered view in order to see the actual lighting effects. These considerations carry over to every section of the room, with all of the mini stages within the largest staged room. The materials being affected by the light will differ in appearance when rendered purely because of how the two render engines handle lighting effects, respectively. Cycles, however, will always be my preferred engine of choice to calculate any of my glass, glossy, or reflective materials, simply because it brings it much closer to realism over Eevee. By rotating around your scene and doing your lighting checks, the end result should be a fully developed room with balanced and complementary lighting in all of the key areas. A standard guideline to follow when developing the layouts for your rooms is that excellent lighting can make almost anything look superb. Poor lighting can make the most detailed models and the most intricate scenes look extremely subpar. In our next session, we'll be exploring a different room in the manor, stepping into the challenge of lighting a new space that's in theme but has a personality of its own. Light can change the overall presentation of a space and create different feelings in you, depending on how your brain interprets the data. We'll be looking at how to use light to shape and curate the experience of being in a space and how you can use those techniques across all of your projects. Thanks for watching this tutorial with me today. I sincerely appreciate the time we've spent together as we take the tour of the manor, moving room to room, discussing the process of layout, lighting, and the life of luxury in collaboration with the House of Dukes. The House of Dukes is a resource where men of substance refine themselves and understand how to be seen and heard for who they are. This image management and personal branding entity influences everything from menswear to architecture, literature, travel, and men's luxury lifestyle exploration. The mission of the House of Dukes is to become a portal for men to experience a higher quality and class of life from the inside out, starting with you. If you'd like to get your first introduction to the House of Dukes, you could read some of their articles and check out their YouTube page at the links below. This is Kyle Stephen for the Digital Academy in collaboration with the House of Dukes, looking forward to the Class 5 in the manor. As we journey on, remember to stay focused, stay consistent, and remember to follow the compass. Thanks everyone.